Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Stuart King is the CEO and founder of BeeZee, a behavior change service design helping individuals develop the highest quality weight management plans using evidence-based methodologies and approaches. Stuart and team work with local groups and authorities to implement the new whole systems approach to obesity, in ensuring that the system as a whole works to benefit individuals, improve their health and well-being, and as a result, their weight. Before, he's been a lifestyle policy implementation manager for Public Health England. Stuart is also the host of an amazing podcast that I see as the perfect complement to this show. What's called the Real World Behavioral Science, where Stuart talks about changing the public's health for good. So I definitely recommend listeners to check that out. Stuart has a BSc in sports science and an MSc in physical activity, health, and well-being. Stuart, welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for having me on.
That's great. So we were just chatting offline before we hit the record and catching up because I know we've chatted a couple times before and sharing all of our insider secrets of podcasting. But I guess I'm going to out us here on the record and say that we're just a couple of hacks interested in behavior and humans, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, and I think most people who know me would agree with that as well. Actually.
Okay. Well then, this should just be a fun conversation between two ordinary dudes, right?
Hopefully so.
So you call yourself the CEO, and I noticed that I think it's on the actual website. Is it head of distraction? Did I read that?
Yes.
Read that right?
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
Who are you distracting?
Well, it goes both ways actually. I distract most people most of the time, particularly in the company, because we employ people that I really love spending time with, and so when I'm in the offices, I just love going and distracting them and chatting to them and getting them to do stupid stuff with me. But I'm also really easy distracted, so I suppose part of having ADHD, I suppose, but I'm really easily distracted. So just distraction in general, just sort of looms around me at any given moment. But we all have at BusyBodies, we all have a title. So you might be a nutritionist or whatever, but you've also got a title that's about you as a person. And so we have gaming gurus and Harry Potter super fans and all that type of stuff.
And yours is head of distraction.
I didn't choose mine. Mine was given to me.
I was going to say, how are those sort of secondary titles given? Are they voted on by a panel or?
Well, they usually come from your colleagues, usually after your probation. So once you've got to know everyone, they think about what encapsulates your personality the most, and then they give you some sort of moniker that fits that.
I love that. That's really cool. I do a lot of stuff with rituals and workplace rituals, and I always am finding little nuggets, little great examples of these local small little rituals that happen in the workplace, and that's actually a nice example. So if you don't mind, I'm going to add that to my list of cited examples of ritual in the workplace.
You should do that. This is a second reference though, because I should actually admit that I stole that from Menlo Innovations in the States. So Rich Sheridan, thanks very much. But yeah, that's where I got that from.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Love it. Okay. So I'm going to talk about myself for a little bit, and then I swear that'll turn into a question eventually.
Okay. It's all about you, Nick. Don't worry.
Yeah. It's my show, right? So early in my adult life, say just sort of fresh out of college, I learned, like, I've always been, this sort of disciplined type A personality, but I also learned that I'm also not the type of person who can sit down and sort of with the best intentions of instilling and coming up with a new habit in my life, be it, eating, exercise, drinking less alcohol or less coffee, et cetera, et cetera. I can't sort of sit down and plan and then successfully carry it out and look back and say, oh, I'm so proud of myself. Look what I just did. I set this plan and I stuck to it. It just never works for me. The discipline of, like, on this day, I will start my new routine. The habit will begin at 12 o'clock and things will sort of successfully roll out from there. Now, I think that's probably a basic explanation of human nature writ large. But I do see myself on the extreme end of that. So what I need, and I think what a lot of people need, are systems, are these sort of external constraints, schedules, things that sort of put me into place. And then once I have those things, then I'm like sort of unstoppable. Then I'm like really good. But if I don't have those, I'm terrible. I don't know how I actually survive. So, anyways, all of that I believe is actually a nice input into some of the behavior change methodology that you guys are doing at BusyBodies, and this notion that I really like, and I'm really hoping you can flesh out a bit for us and for listeners, is this habit before the habit, and maybe helping to explain and making me feel better about myself, that I'm not so screwed up and that I'm like everyone else.
I'm afraid it probably is true, Nick. No, I think it's completely normal. I sit here listening to you thinking, God, we're just the same. I can't do that very easily either. In fact, I'm writing a book a moment about the habit before the habit, and I was writing about my own experience this morning at 4 a.m. this morning. About that exact thing, about sitting and planning, and how that can go badly for us. So I suppose how I best describe it. We do this with families. We do this with people on the ground when we're working with adults in our adult weight management programs and behavior change programs. But this is true of most people whenever they try and change anything, right? What we've boiled 15 years of delivering this stuff down to is, in a really simple way to understand it, is that it comes down to three universal truths. First universal truth: we're not as rational as we like to think. Anyone who's listening to this show doesn't need to be explained why, but we do. Dan Ariely basically just completely stole Dan Ariely's experiments, and we do them live with people. I do it in talks when I give them. I do it in programs. We do it. All of our staff do it when they're out with people on site. Because people have to feel that irrationality. If you ask them questions about it, they sort of nod along, but they don't really think they're irrational.
Mm-hmm.
And so once they realize and you've caught them out, they can't really go back on it. So not being as rational as you like to think is the first one. Second one is sort of Daniel Kahneman-esque, if you like. There's two selves: a planning self and a doing self. Planning self, this is the person that you described. You sit there and you can make plans and all that type of stuff, but we know, as people who are involved in behavior, we know that there's loads of other things that influence our behavior, loads of habits, rituals, the people that we're with, and we really misunderstand how much they influence our decisions, moment to moment, and also how much our emotions and work situations, things like that, they all affect the way we make decisions. And then when your plans don't live out in the real world, when your lived experience is different to what you'd planned, you can quickly find yourself at the third universal truth, which is the what the hell effect. And that's that sort of like, oh Christ, what the hell? I've ruined my diet now anyway. You're not eating cakes at work or whatever. And, I used to work in the NHS, they're full of cakes. So you have a little sliver because it's someone's birthday just to be sociable. But then you think, well, I've had a sliver, I might as well have a whole piece, I'm still hungry or whatever. And then you think, oh, sod it, I've ruined my diet. I'm just going to get a takeaway and a bottle of wine on the way home. I'll start again tomorrow. If you ever said, I'll start again tomorrow, I'll start again Monday, or I'll start again on January the 1st, then you've had the what the hell effect to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what most people's experience of changing anything is like, really. And so we use the habit before the habit, which is basically built up in running experiments. We call them experiments when we work with people, because when you run an experiment, you don't expect to get it all right first time, and you plan a little bit better. And if you don't expect to get it all right first time, there's not this sort of binary: did you achieve it or not? And in the book, I talk about this being akin to, the theory of mindset. So a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. Most people have a fixed mindset. Did I do the thing or not? Did I lose weight or not? But actually, if you take a growth mindset of what can I learn about this thing that I can then run another experiment with, making some small tweaks and improve my chances of succeeding. And most of what we do for people is actually, if you want to put it into sort of behavioral terms, from the behavior change techniques from Susan Mickey's group at UCL, would be like adding objects to the environment, restructuring the physical environment, so that you create an environment in which your future self is more likely to be defaulted towards the thing that you want to achieve. So for me, for example, I'm trying to write the book, and I'm trying to tie that to being healthier, doing more training. And so my charger for my phone is in the room next door to me with the doors open. I have my alarm on loud. All of my training gear is right there. So when my alarm goes off, I have to get up to turn it off, even if I wanted to snooze it.
Hmm.
But the thing I learned about myself, and I think about lots of people, is that it's not being up that's a problem; it's getting up that's a problem. And
Mm-hmm.
so that has worked for the most part for me, in doing the writing and in doing the training. But
And
there's
so do
certainly
you get
things
up
about that.
and then do your training and then you're up already, so you might as well write, or is it the other way
No, the
around?
other way around. Totally the other way around.
Ah,
I've got.
interesting.
If you've ever read Brian Tracy's Eat a Frog," I think it's called, or something like that.
Hmm.
I always do the thing that I find really difficult first, and I find writing really difficult. Not once I'm doing it. Again, it's once I'm writing, it's fine, but
Mm-hmm.
I sort of come to the computer as feeling like an imposter. Like, why am I writing? Who am I to write a book? That type of
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And also, when there's no deadline for something, I find it really hard to focus on it and get it finished. I
Mm-hmm.
work better under severe pressure. So something like writing the book has numerous times over the last 9 months or so that I've been writing it sort of slipped down the agenda, and I've just sort of had the what the hell effect with it.
Yeah. I think we're the same person, just with a different accent.
Yeah.
And you probably
Mine's
train a
better.
little bit more than me.
My accent's better though.
Yeah, of course, yeah. um, yeah, so a couple things. I love this idea of starting with the more difficult thing. And I totally get that writing feels difficult. I've been writing um for the better part of the last decade within academia and now outside of it in practice, and you'd think that I would eventually come to accept the fact that, like, okay, this is a part of what I do, this is who I am. I actually enjoy it to some extent if it's going well. And yeah, and it's not, but that's not the case. I will still, every time when I have to sit down and write, there's this pang in the pit of my stomach
Mm.
that prevents me from actually sitting down. So I have to have these systems, and I have to more or less force myself to do it. And then as you said, once I'm doing it, I'm good.
Okay.
um
Can I
it's
tell you a
yeah.
couple of other slightly embarrassing things about this?
Yeah.
One is that one is that whenever I'm doing anything important and I'm coming to the end of it, I think it's ADHD, or it could just be my personality. It's like I have this unstoppable thing in my head that's trying to get me to run away from it. So I never get to finish things. I do finish things, but I have to put extreme things in place. So, for example, I'm
Mm.
writing the book. I've got a ghostwriter who's not writing; he's just sort of supporting me. He's not mentoring me, I suppose.
Mm.
And he has a check and it's signed and everything ready to go to the Church of Scientology.
An anti charity. I love it.
Basically for £500, and any week, it's £500. It has to be severe. It has to be serious, right?
Yeah.
And any week that I don't give him a minimum of 5 hours writing, but ideally more like 7 or 10. And I'll never lie, because I don't lie. But
Mm-hmm.
if I don't give him that on the Friday by midnight, then he gets to send that check to someone, to
I love it.
the Church of Scientology.
Church of Scientology. How come that was your anti charity of choice?
Yeah, it's just mad, like the stuff that goes on. I love religion, really. I look at all the different religions. I'm really I love learning about them all and stuff, because they're so interesting from a behavioural standpoint. They are
Yeah.
fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And I love learning about people and what they believe and rituals and all that type of stuff. But that one, yeah, that one's pretty crazy. And so I'm sure, knowing how litigious they are, this could be a problem. But this is the truth. He has got a check, and it is to them. They could stand
That's
to gain
fascinating.
from it.
Yeah, that's I love that, and maybe I'm gonna do something similar. And yeah, and I could go on about Church of Scientology. There's that great documentary. I can't remember what it's called, but
Going Clear was one of them.
yeah, I think that was it. My mouth was on the floor.
Yeah,
I was just
and then there's
shocked
the
the
Louis
entire
Theroux
time.
one as well, actually.
Okay, I can't remember which one. It was a few years ago now, but yeah, if anyone who hasn't seen it, definitely go check that out, and you will totally understand why that is the anti-charity of choice for yourself. Another example, if we're just sharing sort of I hate this word, but hacks, tips and tricks that work for us, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember writing about this a few years ago. I have actually, right by my feet right now is a very large dog, Great Dane. She's like 150 pounds. And I've never seen an appetite on a dog like this. So a couple years ago when, and it was even worse when she was a puppy, like really young. And so she eats like 4 or 5 pounds of raw meat a day.
Wow.
And when I was going to the gym early in the mornings a couple years ago before my daughter was born, same thing. I didn't. It was really difficult to get up. It's the middle of winter here in Toronto, Canada. It's the last thing you want to do is get out of that warm, cozy, duvet.
Yeah.
And so what I would do, I noticed that my dog, she has to eat every 12 hours. It's like it's some rhythm, some biological rhythm that's built within her.
Mm-hmm.
So if I fed her the night before at say 7 p.m., she would be up pestering me, howling, forcing me to get up at exactly 12 hours later, 7 a.m. So then I decided to build that in to help me get up at 5. So I made sure the night before, in sort of thinking about my future self and the future situation, that I would feed her at 5 p.m. because I knew that she would help me get up at 5 a.m. And then once I'm up, it's like, okay, my training stuff is laid out. Let's get dressed, get out the door, go to the gym. And it actually worked.
Incredible. That is a biological alarm clock.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, so that seems to have worked for me, but I think I need to get back into that. So I love that. This what the hell effect is that coined by yourself and the Busybodies team, or did you guys find that somewhere?
No. God, I need to think where I got that from. The what
It's
the hell
really
effect? It wasn't me. No, I picked it up from somewhere. I can't
Mhm.
remember where. If I find out, I'll send it to you and maybe put it in the notes.
Yeah, and we'll put it in the show notes. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah,
I mean, it is such a. I think like every single person can relate to that feeling. And it has me thinking, because we're sort of, well, now towards the end of January, but we're in January no less, and January 1st is the rate of gym memberships and these healthy habit subscriptions really peaks January 1 because of what we know of the fresh start effect. So typical, it's January 1, but it could be the start of a month, the start of a work week, so a Monday. These sorts of time and calendar dates and things that happen in our world.
Any year that's got a 9 in it, like your 29th, 39th, 49th.
Oh,
anything
yeah,
before
yeah.
something with an O in it.
Yeah. So it makes me think then, like, given that, so I'm sort of layering the what the hell effect against the fresh start effect. It's almost that if a person who takes a bite of that cake, they say, "Oh, I'll start my diet, or I'll start on Monday." So they're using the fresh start effect as a bit of a crutch to then give themselves license to overeat or do whatever it is that's breaking their habit. Just something that comes to mind. So I think
licensing thing.
that's and it reminds me of that as well. And I remember writing about this a couple of weeks ago. We think that the fresh start effect is such a good thing, especially at this time of year, as I said. But you have to be careful. You have to be careful of, there are times when it backfires, which is true of just about anything within psychology and behavioral science. There's no cure-all. There's always these contextualized effects that we need to be very much aware of. Turns out we're a little bit complicated people.
Yeah, I agree with it.
So just to pivot, I'm not sure if you've heard, there's at UPenn and Wharton, there's this team of super smart behavioral scientists. I think it's being led by Angela Duckworth and Katie Milkman, where they were looking at how to increase the likelihood and the frequency with which people are attending the gym, going to the gym. And we know there are these nudges or these behavioral interventions that seem to work, but they were interested in, I think it's called the behavior change for good, something along those lines. They were interested in seeing if there were any additional interventions that could be tested and tried out to see if we could see the needle move even more, to get a bit of an additional bump up on those rates of gym attendance. So I believe they ran one of the first samples. Maybe it was a pilot, but the results, from what I've heard, early results, preliminary results, aren't all that promising. Apparently, the usual things that seems to work, like the text reminders, the intention setting, even some basic economic sort of incentives, like paying people $0.25 to go each time or something like that. Those you do see some bump up in those, but in addition, there's these other things aren't seeming to they don't seem to work. So you're an expert in behavior change and healthy lifestyles, and what's your take on that? I like to be a bit optimistic in thinking that there's other things out there, we just haven't discovered them. But where do you sit on that, and what do you make of those early findings?
So I think I missed, Nick, what they actually did. What did they actually do? They
So
sent
they had
nudges.
they had a bunch of different people and gyms around the U.S., and they came up with new interventions and nudges to get people to go to the gym. And I can't remember exactly what they
Okay.
were, but there was a whole slew of them,
Yeah.
a bunch of different ones. And what they basically found was that any of those new additional fancy nudges weren't actually effective above and beyond your usual
Mm.
text reminders and
Yeah.
economic incentives.
Well, my understanding of how those things usually work best, nudges, for example, usually work best for individual behaviors, attendances at things. For example, at the event I was at yesterday, Dr. Tim Chadbourne, who's the head of the Behavioural Insights team at Public Health England, was
Mm-hmm.
talking about a test that they did in basic text messaging and framing, and they increased cervical screens for women in London to the tune of a very low cost intervention that ended up with something like 13,000 more people getting a cervical screen off the back of this really low cost and simple intervention. Now that's how nudges work really well. When you're trying to nudge someone through complex behavior, or a complex ongoing behavior change, I don't think nudges particularly work very well. Nudges within them could, in theory, I think. But what I think they very often fail to do is take into account the sort of sociological issues that surround people. Like I really love a theory called habitus, which is a sociological theory by a Frenchman called Pierre Bourdieu, and it just perfectly describes where people's taste, preferences, and expectations come from, and if you want to change their behavior in something like an ongoing behavior like being physically active, especially if it's attending a gym, it for me needs to be linked much more to things like identity. I'm a person who, and also to take into account that sociological framework of, who are the people that do that thing, and what identity do they have, and how could you be more like them? I'm not saying that we say that to people
Mm-hmm.
necessarily, but you have to surround yourself with people and an environment that is going to sort of move you more towards that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so I see the gym, and because most people I work with sort of say, I need to go to a gym. I'm like, do you though? Do you enjoy it? Because if you don't enjoy it, don't do that. That is a terrible idea. You
Mm-hmm.
should find something that you really enjoy, because otherwise you're just basing it on willpower. And we know willpower wanes over the course of a day, and certainly over the course of longer periods too. And so for me, yeah, a nudge could help move someone to do something in terms of going to a gym or whatever, or doing some sort of activity. But much more important than that is setting the conditions around them that mean they're going to be defaulted towards them, without thinking, without willpower.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love. I suspect you're right. I think that's bang on. Um, but I guess the reason they attempt these at scale behavioral interventions, these nudges, is because you can do them at scale, is because you
Yeah.
can apply this sort of sweeping intervention across the US with hundreds or probably even thousands, tens of thousands of individuals at multiple gyms. Whereas once you start talking about the sociality piece to it, well, then all of a sudden it becomes much more complex. It becomes a much bigger thing than a simple framing or a prime here or there.
Mm.
But I'm so on board, and I actually love that you brought this up. And I wasn't sure if you would. And but in one of my questions, I actually ask, and I usually just have some very general questions that I want to touch on. But here I'm going to read it out verbatim, because
Okay.
I do want to spend a bit of time here on this. And I said, where does the whole sociality piece fit into the equation of dieting and exercise and healthy habits? As I say, as an outsider looking in, it seems the social psychological piece to the puzzle is mostly missing. Behavior change initiatives seem far too individualistic. Maybe there's an opportunity to socialize some of these experiences. Now for a short breather. This is the part of the show where I tell you, my listeners, how you can contact me and the show team. All episodes can be found on your usual podcast listening platforms, as well as on my website, www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. If you know someone who you think would like the show or find it interesting or relevant, please share away and help spread the love. For any direct feedback, comments, questions, criticisms, you can always reach out to me personally at nhbehaviorist@gmail.com. And remember to subscribe on iTunes Podcast or wherever else you get your podcast fix. And if you're feeling friendly and generous, a rating and review on iTunes would go a long way. Not to stroke my ego, more for helping bring the show and behavioral science to the masses. All right, let's get back to the show and the always insightful Stuart King.
Yeah, I think you're bang on. I actually have a big passion for sociology, and I, 10 years ago, you would have laughed your socks off if I would have said that to you, because I was basically all about physiology. My background was in physiology, and all I cared about was the cardiovascular system, or everything was about physiology for me. And when I started delivering to people in the public, people from low socioeconomic groups, they didn't give a toss about physiology or what I could tell them about the body or whatever. They cared about real stuff that mattered to them. And so I during my master's, realized through listening to Peter Craig, my lecturer at the time, and he's worked with us ever since, by the way. But listening to him talk about a couple of things. One was about his experience in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and working with youth offenders over there, which I won't go into, but I can talk to you about another time or something. It'll just take too long. And the other one was about this sort of notion of habitus. It really changed the way I thought. It fundamentally changed the way we designed our programs to be really holistic and focusing on things like conflict and relationships and stuff like that, because that's the stuff that actually matters. Now, the problem is, and you mentioned this, that you can't do that stuff at scale. So the question is, do you keep looking for something that you can do at scale that works, or do you accept that people are really complex and messy, and you have to be okay with embedding yourself and enmeshing yourself in that messiness to be able to support them in a holistic way that actually means something to them? And so that's how we approach our work. That said, even if that nudge only worked in 5% of people, if you scaled that up enough, that would probably still be a really worthwhile thing to do, provided it didn't adversely affect 95% of people.
Right, yeah, as long as it's not any
as long as there's no negative effect to it. Yeah.
Collateral damage there.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I it's something that I wrestle with, because we want to see impact. We want to see that these things are working. And I mean, even when you think about like just technology and digital products, every startup, every sort of entrepreneurial venture, all they talk about is scale, scale, scale. So you're designing these solutions, you're designing these products in such a way so that they work, so that there's as few friction, they're frictionless as possible. There's good user experience. They're all the things that you want a product to be. But you're thinking about that in the context of the average of what's going to work for the majority of people. But when it comes to psychology and applying behavioral science and behavioral insights to people, especially when we're dealing with tricky things like eating and exercise and healthy lifestyle routines, I doubt we can just scale and think about the average. We have to think about individuals, and we have to tailor things, and we have to consider edge cases. So I wonder how we're actually going to reconcile those two views. The one thing that comes to mind, and I know there's some work being done, Josh Wright from Ideas 42 and Dilip Soman at Rotman are now talking about the heterogeneity of different nudges. What will work for you won't work for me, given our demographics, given our social background, given our personalities. I think that is a space we haven't even touched yet, so that we can maybe do these nudges, these interventions at scale, but do them, with some granularity built in, knowing that people are complex, knowing that
Yeah.
there's these differences.
I think it's a really interesting point, Nick, and it brings me to one of the big pieces of work that I'm involved in at the moment, which is considering whole systems approaches and system science generally,
Hmm.
because we've mentioned nudge a fair bit. A nudge is something that you can use for some things some of the time, but that's a tool that works in some circumstances. There are loads of other tools, and a good example of that is, if you, I mean, I don't know how much you've looked into the COMBI theory by Susan Mickey's group
Mm-hmm.
at
Yep.
UCL, and
UCL.
the behavior change taxonomy that goes alongside
Mm-hmm.
it, and the theoretical domains framework. But what that describes is a load, a good way of considering human behavior, but you have to have deep domain knowledge to be able to interpret it correctly. If you just do it from an academic standpoint, it never works. This is what I was talking about at this event yesterday. But the thing that needs to sit around inside is the fact that people need different things at different levels. So we need to be acting. So for example, in the UK, we've got a sugar tax at the moment. So we need that legislative element of reducing sugar in people's food, because people have no impact. No ability to impact what food producers do, for example, but the government does. So we have an opportunity to legislate our way into some reduction of calories and improvement of nutritional makeup in foods and stuff through what Public Health England, for example, are doing. But also there are cultural issues that we can start to sort of mine into. And if you look at some of the biggest movements that have gone on, the Me Too movement, all those different types of the climate change stuff, all of that comes from someone, and it pervades into our sort of cultural milieu. And ultimately, we need things at the national level, we need things at the local level, we need things that are culturally driven, but we also need things that are at the personal level, and the personal level at families, including friends and your immediate social environment, but also at a biological level, because the way I react to certain foods isn't the way that someone else reacts to certain foods. And so taken together, we need interventions at all of these different levels, and overall, through marginal gains, a marginal gains effect, you see that people on the whole, and this is people across society on the whole, are able to sort of improve their outlook, improve their outcomes in terms of their health related behavior, including their mental health.
Totally. And it's like you also need the experts at all of those different levels of analyses. So you need the sociologist, you need the public policy person, you need the psychologist, and then all the way down to you need the physiologist, the person who understands the really low level biological mechanisms. But through this attempt of consilience, and through this attempt of coming together and putting the pieces all back, putting them back together, you get a much more complete picture of the human and the system in which they exist.
Absolutely.
Now I'm optimistic, coming from the world of academia, those different levels of analyses, everyone's doing their own thing with a set of blinders on. You have the psychologists or the behavioral scientists, like my world, who have just been steeped in this culture, and they're very smart and they know what they're doing, and they can talk at great lengths about behavioral science phenomena, but they don't know anything, and they don't even know how to begin having a conversation with the other person who sits, at the other level of analysis, say like a sociologist, because they go to their own conferences, they publish their own papers. They're not even talking. They're not even close to having open dialogue and conversations. But in practice, when we're talking about behavior change, when we're talking about even like scaling it up to legislative action, these people are sitting in the same offices, they're working in the same firms. So not only are they having conversations, but they're actually working together to solve the same problems. And so I think what has plagued academia in terms of the knowledge and the research that we do, I think that's actually going to be fixed for us in industry, and I'm actually very hopeful about that. So thank you for breaking that down. And
Well,
go ahead.
Well, I just had, because You are right. I mean, academia. I was speaking to some academics. I was speaking to a lot of academics through my own show, and what they say is, in the UK at least, and I'm sure this is happening internationally as well, but please tell me if it's not. It, it, your funding as an academic was always based on, you've got to publish, you've got to publish,
Mm-hmm.
you've got to publish, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so there was immediately competition, interdepartmental competition for where funding goes and all that type of stuff. So there was a disincentive to work together.
Mm-hmm.
Now they've moved that a little bit so that there's also an emphasis on impact. And so in the UK, they're working on creating projects that are multidisciplinary, and they're talking about it being impactful, but still there's a heavy weight on publishing. This is what academics are still telling me. However, it is a step in the right direction, so I am pleased about that. The issue
Yeah.
with that, to a certain extent, is that people's lives aren't segmented in the way that university departments are. We don't have like a sociology department, or we have sociology issues, and then we also have psychological issues, and we have physiological issues. They're all
Yeah.
linked. If you've got a physiological issue, it weighs on your mental health, and and on the amount that you can be social. They all link up, all these things in real life, and we approach them sometimes from with a specific lens. And I think adding diversity to these things, genuine diversity, is the way that we actually stop sharing. We don't share blind spots in that respect, and so we can actually do a lot more, because we see what's worked in other fields work in our field, and in our field working in other fields. And having worked a lot in Public Health England, in the NHS, and in local authorities in the UK, you say they're working on the same problems together. If I understood what you were saying, right, they're working in the same offices and they're working on the same problems. What I experienced, because I used to do, we were calling it an early version of whole systems. It was like, an expert group, or a group where you had, for example, healthy weight, you had leisure services, transport, planning. They all came to develop a joint strategy around obesity, for example. But the fact was that it was all in addition to their current roles, and none of it was anything that they were measured on. So none of the stuff that they were saying, yeah, we can support you on this, was something they were measured on. And therefore, as soon as they got some sort of pressure in the system, or the funding got squeezed, everything that they'd done in that group was gone.
Was dropped.
But that's where whole systems approach is in theory going to be different to that. But that remains to be seen. That's sort of quite a new thing here, and we're working on it. But
Is that something? Is that a broader initiative within Public Health England, or like where does this come from?
Public Health England released a paper in October last year, and I'm very specifically speaking about obesity, although systems thinking is generally becoming more pervasive in the UK. But the whole systems approach to obesity, you can find that online if you go to .gov.uk and search whole systems approach. You can find the PhD paper on whole systems approach to obesity, and that talks about things like feedback loops, for example, within a system. Someone the stores are shopping a lot of convenience food, which means people are buying a lot of convenience food. They get de-skilled in terms of they don't need to cook, so they don't cook. Therefore, they eat worse, and they're looking for more convenience food because they can't cook. So the stores, in relation to the needs of the people, stock more convenience food, and that's just a sort of a vicious cycle. And they call that a feedback loop in there, which is quite a simple. Obviously, that's quite a simple idea, but it's never really been said in that way. I don't think in as far as I've been doing this 15 years, and I've not seen it said in that simpler way and be taken seriously.
That's great. I really like that, this whole systems approach. I'll be sure to link to that. And maybe I keep going back to this sort of academia versus industry or policy and business, what have you. Maybe I was sort of criticizing the academics for these silos and for not taking an interdisciplinary approach to their research, but maybe it's the case that they can continue to be the specialists. Those findings and that knowledge can then be disseminated and shared and come out of the academy and into practice. And then it's incumbent on the practitioners like you and I and everyone else probably listening to this show to find the connecting points and to say, okay, now let's take this broader systems approach and see how we can sort of fit it into the overall into the bigger picture. And I know that's been said in a previous episode as well, that's why academics are academics, is because they do the specialist stuff, and
but the
there's
best
merit to that.
academics, yeah, I think there is sometimes, but the thing that I think more and more, we are the best academics I've spoken to and worked with are ones that have taken themselves off into the real world, and they've spent time in projects, and they spoke to people, and they've really gone out and tried to immerse themselves in the content. Because when you ask people what they do, you hear some of what they think they did, but when you observe them, you see something completely different. And that academic could be picking up on real nuanced stuff that's going on that no one else can, but they have to go and observe it. They can't rely on some sort of some data collection that just doesn't give them that level of information. And I think that academics are the product of their own system. So if they have worked in silos, it's probably not because they want to work in silos. It's probably because there's a disincentive to them not doing that. People are always the product of the system in which they operate. And so, if there was a disincentive to share work because you may have to share funding, it's a no-brainer. People just keep their work to themselves and try and be an expert in their siloed field.
Yeah, totally. I agree with you on that. And so just to change topics slightly, vaping is there's a lot of talk in the US and North America about vaping, and there's this research on the economic and the legislative split on vaping between North America and the UK. What I've heard is that the UK takes more of a harm reduction approach versus the US or North America takes a more abstinence-based approach. And you see that playing out in the different policies and pieces of legislation around curbing vaping usage, especially in young people and teens. And I'm curious just to get your reaction with harm reduction. Harm reduction basically makes certain assumptions that says that people are going to engage in certain behaviors. We know we're fallible. We know these things there's temptations, especially with these properties that are addictive. Whereas the abstinence assumes, perfect willpower. If a person doesn't want to do this thing, like, smoke a cigarette or smoke a vaping product, then they won't. But now we're actually seeing a lot of these negative unintended consequences come from the abstinence-based approach. And I think what I've heard is that we're actually looking to the UK to initiate some of this, what they see as probably more accurate legislative action that's more reflective of actual human behavior. Just curious to get your thoughts on whether the one sits with you better or where you're at with that.
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on vaping or smoking cessation, but I do speak to people about it sometimes because I'm in public health, so that's a big part of public health. And I think to take a slightly sort of different view on it, if you take the same two approaches and you apply it to sex education and sex and relationship education, and the US have certainly had a history, or they've in certain areas at least, they've had a history of abstinence-based approaches towards sex education. Just say no, that type of stuff, and that doesn't work because that assumes rationality. That assumes that in the moment someone's going to be able to say no, and we know that when you are aroused, whether it's aroused through sexual contact or whatever, or whether it's aroused through peer pressure at school if you're a young person or whatever, you are going to make different decisions in the moment than you would when you're sitting planning and doing an education-based sort of approach. I think harm reduction is the way forward because I think that was based on evidence in terms of we know what the startup rate is and we know who it is that's doing it. And so if we know that those people are going to do it, then it's better that they do vaping than smoking, because we know that although the jury is out at the moment and the evidence is still being accumulated from the long-term effects of vaping, and obviously that's what's coming out in the States at the moment about sort of people with significant lung issues. It seems to me, and this is a very uninformed view, but this is my take on it. people with very serious lung issues, vaping is a terrible thing for them. But for the vast majority, but then equally so would smoking be. But for the vast majority, vaping would be a much better alternative to smoking. The issue slightly is by diminishing the level to which you're saying it's bad. Do more people then take it up as a result? And that's the bit I think remains to be seen. But I definitely lean towards the UK on this one, because not because I'm over here. I just think that is a much more true to the human experience approach that would likely have the best outcome.
Yeah, I agree. And that's sort of, I'm not surprised that you had the sort of a similar reaction. And it is interesting. Like, I never thought of the sex education. I'm sure there's other examples where North America and the US took the abstinence versus the harm reduction approach. And I'd be curious, I don't know, and I'm not even going to dare to speculate or even try to comment on why there's those cultural differences between, say, UK, Europe, and the US. Like even with drinking, I don't know why this comes to mind, but it's like the drinking age in most of the US is 21. Legal drinking age is 21. Canada, it's 19. What's it in the UK?
18.
You can
but regularly see 13-year-olds down the park doing it. You're interested.
But it just makes me think of like back to culture and social principles. You go to a lot of European countries and like wine at dinner and you know, even young kids will have like wine, you know, starting at like age 14 in the family, and versus
so you can do that here
US.
too. Actually, I think if you go to a restaurant and you're with adults, you can have wine at 14 in a restaurant, or alcohol.
Oh, really?
I'm fairly certain. Don't definitely quote me on that, and I'm happy to be wrong about that. But I certainly have heard that, and I'm fairly sure that's true.
But it suggests, like, again, I think the whole assumption in the abstinence approach is that humans are rational. We are fairly straightforward. We're simple. If we don't want to do something, we won't. There's no such thing as a temptation. We're basically like Spock, and we know that's just simply not true. And I think there's a lot of unintended consequences that come from relying on those assumptions that we're now seeing play out in the U.S. that you don't necessarily see in other Western countries like the UK or other European countries. So, sort of a broader thing that I'm thinking about. Couple more questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
one, that I heard about a few months ago. So Dan Ariely, have you heard about his scale that he has on the market?
Scale?
Like a weight scale?
No.
Okay, so this is great.
That's a shame, because I'm a real big fan of Dan Ariely. I'm trying to get him on my show actually, but he's not coming on.
Oh, he's a tough one to get.
He's
a elusive
He's
figure.
a real hero of mine, though. I have to say, I he's one of the main reasons I got really interested in the field.
Oh yeah,
I read a lot of Dan Ariely. Yeah. It was because it was just such an accessible way in, and I just became really sort of enamored with the whole thing. You know, I loved it. I'm not an expert. I'm an enthusiast. That's what I would say to people.
Well, so then all the more reason you have to check this out. It's called Shapa. SHAPA, which maybe it's Shapa. I doubt it. Shapa seems to make more sense given, you know, weight. So the idea is, and I'll link to this in the show notes. It's fascinating. There's no digital read. So it's actually not giving you any, it's not telling you your weight. There's no number feedback. So it's sort of an unquantified way to quote unquote manage your weight and generally your health. So the logic is, or the rationale is, that most scales, when people step on them, it reminds them that they've screwed up. There's the shame, there's the regret, there's this notion of like self-disgust. If they have gained even a little bit of weight. And that's crazy because we know weight fluctuates dramatically. Even within a day, you can fluctuate between 1 and 2-3 pounds, even for some people. And so the whole idea of a scale is if you're sticking to your routine and you're really gung-ho about losing weight, is it's supposed to encourage you, when in fact, in most cases, and I think Dan and the team he's working with on this would say it's actually just, if anything, it's discouraging people. They see it and they say, what the hell? I've just gained 0.5 pound, but I just went for a run. What's going on? Nothing's working. Oh, screw it. I'm going to eat this cake.
Yeah.
So
Starve myself all week for this.
exactly, and then it leads to just sort of overall unhealthy approaches to weight loss. So anyway, Shape'a, this product is um, it communicates to an app of some kind, and it presents your health, not just your weight, but your health, because it takes other metrics like bone density. I think it's gathering a few other metrics in addition to weight, and it gives you feedback in the app on a 5-point scale. So sort of like a Likert scale of 1 to 5. You're either a little better, a little worse, much better, much worse, or you're basically the same. So it's not that you're not getting any feedback whatsoever, but it's giving you just the right amount of information, just the right amount of feedback that you need to continue to feel motivated and to continue to feel that you can stick to your plan, whatever it may be. So what do you think of that as somebody who's in this space? I think it's an interesting idea.
No, I think it's really interesting. I'm not just saying that because I'm a fan of Dan, but I'd love to see the data on that. I was just looking at it whilst you were talking there a little bit, and it's not. I don't think I can get it here, but the premise is a good one in as much as in my book, what I'm going to be saying is as I said before, shifting from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And the way I liken that is fixed mindset. Did I lose weight or not? Versus a growth mindset. What do I now know about myself? And failure is where all the good stuff is, right? In this, because you need to know you can't plan perfectly. And so if you make a plan and bits of it don't work, that's fine. If you then take that and say, what would I do differently next time? And then you rerun the experiment and then learn again, then rerun the experiment from the failure. So having a it sounds to me like this is much more akin to having a growth mindset and learning about what works for you, and actually what do you actually want? Do you just want the scales to tell you you're lighter, or do you actually really want to be happier? Do you think that by being thinner or lighter you're going to be happier? And therefore are you actually ultimately aiming for being happier? Which everyone is. It just means different things to different people. So I'm totally on board with this approach. I mean, I want to look at the evidence behind it a little bit more, but it's certainly an interesting premise. It's something that I'm excited to look into.
Yeah, that's what, and I'm not sure. I haven't done a whole lot of research into it, but I'm not sure if there's any preliminary data. I'm sure there is. It's Dan Ariely.
Yeah.
He's very very evidence driven and empirically grounded. So I'd be really interested to see. And if I do find it, I will also definitely link to it. But yeah, anyways, it's really interesting. We'll see. It could just blow up and be the next thing in weight management. We'll see.
Well, either it will be bought up by one of the big weight management groups, and there's a decent number of them that sort of predicated on failure. So they might well just close that down.
Yeah, that's right.
Buy it and close it down. We'll take that patent. Thanks very much, Dan.
Yeah.
Now keep quiet. NDA. Just keep quiet.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully not.
Yes. That's a bit cynical. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm actually a really optimistic person. But
No, it was a joke. It was all in jest. We could see that. Okay. One last question. What I call the BBB, the big behavioral brainstorm. So lots of issues in society these days, some of which we've covered in the last hour chatting. What do you see as the one that calls for a behavioral style intervention? And how do you see that playing out?
Well, a couple of, I mean, I see that anything that is behavior related should have a behavioral approach and not just a common sense approach. But I really enjoyed listening to some of the other podcasts. I liked what Eileen said about behavioral science solving something that's already rife in my industry, so the intention action gap. But since she's fixing that, I suppose I should choose something else. But I suppose this might not be considered as behavioral science initially, but stick with it. There's a book that I read recently that had a big impact on me called Rebel Ideas by Matthew Said, who's the author of Black Box Thinking as well. And I recently wrote a funding application off the back of this sort of idea about extreme diversity and about ideas having sex, which is, and I wrote a blog about that too, which is, it comes back to this thing that we were talking about with the academics, where the most Nobel Prizes nowadays are won by multidisciplinary teams, because that extreme diversity in the group means that you bring lots of failure and also lots of success from lots of different industries and put it into the mix on one problem. And then by having all those different people with all those different viewpoints and experiences, a lack of shared blind spots means that you don't fall into the trap of like groupthink. So one of the things that I'm trying to work out how to do is to pull huge numbers of data sources and really extreme forms of data that have never been put into one place before, have them dispassionately studied and analyzed by people who haven't got an agenda going in, and they just look for significant divergences and correlations in the data to start saying what is in this data and what data exists within here that coalesces, and then have behavioral science come in and say, okay, well, if this is where all the data coalesces, what could we do at the system level? What could we do at the the social level? What could we do at the individual level that's got a really robust behavioral science background to it, to test how we could influence a whole system, but using data and opinions, ideas from people from all sorts of realms of industry, academia, government, and just lay people, and anyone who can sort of come and bring an idea to the mix. It's quite a messy idea, I'll grant, but it's the one I'm really excited about bringing to fruition, because I think that there would be a really interesting outcome from doing things in that way and not presupposing anything on the way in.
That's great, and I think it puts a nice bow on a lot of the themes we touched on in the last hour. Just this sort of whole systems approach, and considering multiple angles. And I think that's going to be the new wave. If we're finished with the first wave of behavioral science and behavioral revolution, is going to be that. Seeing things from multiple vantage points and consilience between our field and other fields to get the best possible look at what's going on, the human and the surroundings in which the human exists.
Totally agree.
Well, Stuart, thanks so much. This has been a real pleasure, as always. Anytime we chat, where can people find you if they want to find you online?
Okay, well, I'm on Twitter at Stu_King_HH, which is the habit before the habit bit. I do more on LinkedIn, to be honest. So add me on LinkedIn, and I've got a blog, which if you go to BeeZeeBodies.com, which is BeeZee bodies.com, and then in the professional section, I have a blog where I talk about mainly public health issues, and also my show, the Real World Behavioral Science podcast, which is on Apple, Google, Stitcher, and Spotify. So you can just search for the title on there.
Great. And the book, when can we expect to see it? To hold you to your
Do I want to put a date down here,
yeah. Roughly.
Well, in theory, I want to have it out by the summer. So I'll say the summer, and and we'll see how many checks I write to the Church of Scientology in the meantime.
Yeah, keep us posted on if I really see them increasing their funding. I know it's because you're not hitting your deadlines.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Stuart, we're best of luck. I look forward to seeing that, and I'll be sure to link out to all those things that you mentioned so people can find you in the show notes. All right, my man. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much, Nick. Real pleasure talking to you.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2,
you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.